Trent Siegle, Midwest Land Group. Thank you guys for bringing this closing property gift to the landowner that just purchased this property down in Kansas. One thing about a lot of Kansas, it's a lot different than what you read about and what you see in videos in the Midwest, the East Coast, and heavily wooded areas. Our ratio of timber to open ground and crop ground is very, very low. That means a couple things. It makes it pretty easy to identify where the deer are going to bed and travel when the corn is out, unless there's CRP or some other kind of circumstance that's going to factor in. So in areas like this, we have to do the best we can. It really is a top priority not to disturb the animals as they're bedded here or traveling here by surprising them with our sights, sounds, and smells. So basically what we look at is I can turn on this blue here, and in the neighborhood where we're going to be hunting on this property, we can identify the rough ground, the timbered areas, where the cedars are, where the cuts and draws are, where the drainages are, where the grass is, anywhere there's some type of cover for those deer to bed in and travel through where they feel like they're not completely exposed is where they're going to be. That's where they're going to be. Those are the areas we don't want to disturb. We don't really want to walk through there if we don't have to. We don't want our scent blowing in there, and we don't want our sights and smells going and sounds going in there either. We don't want to surprise the deer in those situations. So when you look at a property like this, it's almost easier to color in something like this blue and say, okay, I don't want my scent to blow there because either the deer are sleeping there during the day or the deer are going to be traveling through there during the low light hours. Now that's daylight stuff. Now at night, the opposite is true. Not the opposite, but we have to add areas to it where these deer might be feeding at night. So if this area right here is a corn or a bean field, cut corn or a green bean field, if this area here was alfalfa, if this area here over here was some cereal grains where the deer are feeding at night, we don't want our scent blowing in there in the dark. So it makes it much easier to figure out where these deer are going to be during daylight. They're going to be in the blue areas, or they're going to be in CRP, or they're going to be in standing corn. So sometimes we have to add those areas in and say we can't let our sights, sounds, and smells surprise deer there during the day. And then at night, we just have to keep our eyes on the crop rotations and know that, like we said, if it's a food source where those deer are going to be spending the night, we don't want to surprise deer with our sights, sounds, and smells there in the dark. So how do we tackle that? How do we go after that? Well, let's pretend this blue is daylight stuff, and that's how we're going to address this property. That's where the deer are going to be bedded, so we have to leave those areas free of disturbance. Now that we know where the deer bed, the next thing we have to look at is access. And on this property, we have access from the south, and we have access from the east. These are areas, these roads are areas of known human activity, where if there's a person there, it doesn't surprise the deer. They've got us pegged, they know we're there. Very, very rarely somebody will walk these areas. There's always cars stopping on these areas. They're used to a human presence there, and they work around it. The other area of access we have is your campground area right here. The deer are going to come to learn that there are people here in this campsite area, and if we don't do something about that, they're going to avoid it. And the one thing we have trouble hiding from these deer that are coming through this funnel, and if you look at this whole property, at this neighborhood overall, we have a lot of deer activity down here, bedding and traveling. A lot of deer activity, bedding and traveling. Right where your campsite is probably the best funnel, the best bottleneck on the whole property. Because I can easily be here with the west wind, I can let my wind blow over here. With an east wind, I can let my deer blow over here. By setting up on either side of this funnel, I'm really affecting very little deer activity, and I'm hunting at very low impact. Now the thing that will change that, potentially, is the fact that we do have a building and a campsite right here. If you want to eliminate that factor, you take that building in your campsite and you move it over to here or something. So that doesn't happen anymore. The other thing we can do is we can create a visual screen that creates a black and white line. The deer feel it's a black and white line between the purple human activity and the blue deer activity. How do we create that visual screen? We can do it with a bulldozer and create an earthen berm, or we can do it with some kind of cover, some kind of vegetation. That can be an annual plot like a 3-layer sorghum mix. It could be silage corn. It could be, sorghum's probably better in some of these areas down here if we're not getting enough rain. It's a much more drought-tolerant crop. There are commercial plot screens we can put there. We could plant cedar trees there and let them come and do establishment. But the one thing that is important is we do have to have some kind of visual screen here if we're going to be camping here. Because if we don't, we are going to queer a lot of daylight activity through here. And we don't want to do that. If we got something good going on, we don't want to be the people that mess that up. Now, if we choose to leave the campground here and we're in there, this food plot here, this area right next to the campsite, might be the most highly productive place in the whole property, that and this one here. And the reason for that is if these deer are still coming through here, because we have that visual screen, and we don't destroy that illusion that we only exist in this purple circle, the driveway, and this road, the deer are going to use this outside edge of the property. If we have a food plot here, this blind here, we can have the wind blowing back to the campsite. This blind here, we can have the wind blowing straight out of the west, or a west-northwest, even a northwest wind. We got a lot of good places for our wind to blow, and with the screen around this food plot, 10 to 12 foot wide screen, 10 to 12 foot tall, we have a ton of options to, we can get in and out of here. We can hunt these spots 100 times if we want. We could have deer that were bedding in this plot, feeding in this plot all day long, and we can come in and out of this blind 20 times a day and never booger those deer up. And then when those deer are feeding there, we want to go home at night. We slip out the backside, we go home, slip out the backside, go home. Same scenario here. Short walk from camp, northwest winds, north winds, right? As long as that wind's blowing back towards camp, if the deer catch a sniff of us, they're not as alarmed because human activity, right? And we have access with both these spots to activity on all these blue trails, right? They can all visit these food plots September, October. We could put one over here that would work for a southeast wind or an east wind, right? Query a little bit of activity here, but a great option for us to hunt with an east wind. Short walk from the camp, walk in this way in the afternoon. When we're going to go home at night and the deer are feeding there, slip out the backside along the edge of that screen, come back to camp, okay? Another plot over here. If these drainages are holding deer and our neighbors are facilitating that movement, we can come here, park the truck, walk, whatever we want to do, come in the backside of this ground blind. Ground blinds are a great tool on these plots early season. We don't have to be prepared for the deer. They're going to be there for minutes or even hours sometimes as compared to a ladder stand during the rut when we got a 15-second window when the deer are coming through. We don't have to be super prepared and ready. They're going to be there for a while. But if we're bedding deer in these blue areas and they're traveling these blue areas and we have a north wind, we got just a tremendous spot for our wind to blow. One slight drainage here that might hold deer, okay? But by and large, it's pretty good, especially for a northwest wind. Now, as we said before, if this is corn or if this is alfalfa, if it's something deer are feeding in, right, it's not as bulletproof. If these are dead zones that the deer are avoiding, the deer look at every inch of ground on this property as one of four things. It's a place they bed, like in here, a place they travel through the blue, a place they feed, food plots or local ag, or a deer desert they avoid altogether, which you could maintain some of this as a deer desert. And you want that deer desert on your ground. We want dead spots for our wind to be able to blow when we're hunting, because then we don't alert the local deer herd. If we make this entire property attractive to deer as either bedding or feed, we can't walk more than 10 feet off this property line without having the potential to start bumping deer and blowing it up. We want to bump as few deer as we can. And if we do that in September, October, what it does for us is it beds deer on our property and gives those reasons a buck to visit during November. If we spend too much time in the heart of our property and we bump those does off the property and they go down to the bedding areas down to the south or the bedding areas up here to the north, or they disappear over to this river drainage over here. If we bump the does off of our property, bucks will travel through our property if there's does bedded up here and up here, but they don't have a reason to visit our property. If these neighbors bump all their deer and these neighbors bump their deer, their doe groups, and we bump ours, these deer that live down here don't have a reason to visit us during a rut. And they really don't have a reason to be on these food plots during daylight. So by being careful in September and October, we really up our odds in September and October. We up our odds in November. And it's all about laying out a plan where we got safe winds for our deer to blow during daylight when we're on stand, and at night in the dark, in the morning, in the dark of the evening when we're exiting our stands. The more we can do to not disturb the deer we're hunting, the better off we're going to be. So we covered this food plot, this food plot, this food plot, this food plot with north winds. This food plot here gets us close enough to this activity up here. Might be necessary. And we have another south wind. We got place for the wind to blow. Unless this is a deer feeding area, then it's tougher. I know we had put a deer food plot in here. And what gets, that's one of the best spots on the property to hunt. It's one of the best properties for deer sign and deer activity. That spot, this spot here would be even better. But you can see this spot, if we put a stand here, yeah, we can get in there. Hard to get out of it when there's deer on the plot because they might see us. They might see us coming in because they're bedded in here. Both those variables are taking out with the ground blind in the screen here. They can't see us get in. They can't see us get out. And if there's no reason for them to be back here, there's no place. The wind's not going to blow to them and get them. This thing here, we put ourselves at risk for that a little bit. And all of these deer we could kill in this food plot, we can kill in this food plot, but because they're relaxed, we will have better odds in this food plot. If this food plot had a camera on it and this food plot had a camera on it and we never bothered these deer, this camera would be much busier. But we have to analyze, is it worth putting our presence in there 40 yards closer to start blowing up that activity? My answer is no. I'm not saying not to do it. I'm saying if you can pull this off, we're gonna have better luck. We're gonna have better luck long term. If we're only hunting it like 2 days every other weekend, yeah, go on in here and do it. They'll forgive you by the next time you come out. If we're going to hunt it more than that, or we want multiple stands, and we're going to be there for a longer period of time, this is a safer option. This blows it up a little bit when we go in here. Even just that 2 days is going to chase them does around a little bit and make them nocturnal. Okay? So that's kind of the food plot strategy, September, October. All these deer down here to the south, we can hunt those on here if the neighbors don't mess it up. Right? And the neighboring influence is a factor on here you want to consider. We want to know what all these neighbors are doing and how they're influencing deer activity, because that will decide how you should set up the property. Right? If this neighbor over here is ruining all the deer activity, that means this blind here is excellent for any east wind. This entire area over here is a dead zone. Same with these guys. If these guys are blowing up any deer activity, if they've done something to these ditches, those deer aren't bedding there, all of a sudden winds can blow over here because there's no deer and down here because there's no deer. Becomes a dynamite spot. Makes this blind a little easier. Same up here. So we need to know what the neighbors are doing, if they're allowing access of deer on and off the property, and we're hunting that line of movement because we're hunting those deer that bed down here because those guys aren't messing up, or is that a line of access that I'm using to come down the road, come up this edge, and come hunt this stand? So it's always where can our wind blow in daylight, where can our wind blow in the dark? That has to do with ag crop rotation, CRP, corn, pasture, cow pasture, deer don't really care for, and what the neighbors are doing. You have to make that consideration in to factor in where you're going to spend the time and the money putting these food plots in. Now, a few other changes. I put your deer feeder here, in between this plot and this plot. Any deer down here, any deer up here that want to use the feeder can be killed on these two food plots, right? Depending on what the wind direction is. They can be killed on this food plot too. Some of those deer can be killed on this food plot and this food plot. But it's a place we don't have to bother the deer. They can have that feeder there. We don't have to go in there and hunt it because we have food so close to it. Okay? Did move this blind out of the woods a little bit because of the things we talked about. This blind here, we'd have a view of here. We'd have a view of over here for the rut. Great ideas. I recommended a permanent blind inside this ring, inside this campsite ring too. I mean, we can shoot this plot, we can see this plot, we can see this line of movement, we can see this line of movement, and we can hunt this line of movement. We can get in and out of that blind 100 times a day, and the deer don't know anything is going on. Same principles apply. Another thing I put in here, don't know if you want to do it or not, but inside these lines of movement that we have, I'll turn those off, is we have some, I put aside towards the center of the property, switch old field mix. If we retired some ag, and we put switchgrass there, or just let it grow up in the old field, cedars, grasses, forbs, goldenrod, all that good stuff. The deer will use that for bedding, and these sizes aren't relevant, right? It's just the concept. If we bed more deer in these spots, we have more room on the property for more doe groups. That's more deer visiting the food plots because more deer live on the property, and more incentive for the bucks to visit our property during the rut. And all these are put in places that we can hunt for most of the year without ever bumping those deer. I put another one down here if we wanted to do the same thing. And basically it's switchgrass with these old field circles. Don't plant switchgrass in those circles. Gives us more edge, forbs, goldenrod, cedars, all kinds of regeneration. If we don't have a monoculture of switchgrass, we have a little more incentive, a little more edge, a little more variety for the deer that do want to bed there to live in there. And then during the rut, the strategies, of course, become back to these blue lines of movement, getting right on the edge of those blue lines of movement to hunt those deer, right? Ladder stand here, might bump some does coming in, but the bucks are going to use that during the rut. These red lines, the bucks are going to cruise heavily. West wind, we could sit here in a bow stand if we want. Great spot, right in between these two bedding areas, west wind not blowing there. This spot here during the rut becomes dynamite, this travel corridor. The less the neighbors do to blow this up, the better it is. Does bedding here, 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 here. Those bucks have to cruise and check those bedded does when they're on their feet. And the less this is disturbed, and the more attractive it is to the bucks, the darker this line gets, right? This dark line from the south, great line of contiguous cover flowing on and off the property. This is a great line of contiguous cover through the property. We know the deer are going to use that, and it's anchored by leaving these bedded does alone in the blue areas and the other areas and hunting right on the edge of those blue areas where part of the deer stay. They're using those areas, part of the deer stay, easy for them to get to. Make all these food plots exactly the same, so this one doesn't peak when this one doesn't. Guys might think, well, I want every deer here in October, every deer here in November, every deer here in September. That's not true. Make all these exactly the same, and you have the potential to set up for 5 or 6 different doe groups where they all have their own food plot. They don't have to fight over it. Doe group up here, permanently anchored. Doe group here, doe group here. We can get a doe group down here from the bottom or over in this food plot, and they don't have to fight with each other because all these food plots are exactly the same. So hopefully this video turns out a little better here, a little clearer. You can click on a lot of these icons. They're, a lot of them are common sense, but a lot of them are labeled. And elevated rifle stand, northwest wind, west or southwest wind, whatever safe wind to blow. Don't surprise them with sight, sound, and smell during daylight where they're bedded in the blue or traveling. Don't surprise them with sight, sound, and smell where they're feeding at night. And that's a constant annual and weekly change in these areas as they move and harvest crops, as they move cattle, as they harvest corn, as they till it under, all those different things. So good luck with this property. If you follow these principles on here as best you can and hunt this thing conservatively, you can hunt uneducated deer every single day you hunt this place, and you're going to have the best luck.